Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
All right. Hey, everybody. Let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Thanks for coming out this Thursday evening for our program all about concussions. Something that's definitely topical and something that's definitely been in the news a lot. So I hope that you've been paying attention to your Twitter feeds and you've got lots of things that you want to know about tonight's topic, because we've got a couple of great experts with us. For those of you here, anybody here, this is like only your first or second cafe Thursday night program? Oh yeah, fantastic. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming out. How many of you, this is like your 5,000th cafe? Is that? Yeah, okay, cool. That's what I thought. Love to see all the faces here tonight at the museum. Yeah, you all know, and now the two of you will know, that we're here every Thursday night in the Science Cafe. You can get dinner and a drink here in the Daily Planet Cafe. They're always friendly and helpful and have great stuff. And then learn something new every Thursday, 7 o'clock, right here. And we bring guests on topics all across the spectrum of science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And in this case, I think we'll make the M in STEM be medicine. Is that okay? Can I do that? Is that okay? Can I just change up the acronyms? But it's all science. It's all about us, what we want to know about what's going on in the world of science and how it applies to our daily lives. That's what we do every Thursday night right here in the Daily Planet Cafe. Tonight's guests, we have two who are going to be sharing the stage from the WakeMed Concussion Program. We have Paul Cohen, who's right there, and Brandon Schoonover, who are going to be sharing with us a little bit. And then, of course, after the presentation, after we've learned a little bit about what they know a lot about, we'll give you the chance to ask your questions and share your knowledge with them, and we'll create a discussion about this really important topic. Hint, my first question is going to be how woodpeckers don't get concussions. So y'all can think on that one. Because I'm sure there is an answer, I don't know it. But if I slam my head into this wall 20 times a second, I'm done for. But a woodpecker can manage it. I don't think I had anything to do with tonight. Please put your hands together and welcome to the stage Paul Cohen and Brandon Schoonover.
All right. Thank you guys for having us. We're excited to be here. Like he said, we're with WakeMed Concussion Program. And so we're just going to talk a little bit about concussions and then open it up to Q&A and see what we can answer for you. But huge topic, obviously. You can't really turn on the TV or the news or anything without hearing about it, especially if you're looking at sports and stuff like that. Problem is there's a lot of, well, A, it's very scary, and B, there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. So what we're hoping to do tonight, like the title is, just we want to change the conversation a little bit and talk a little bit about what we're seeing every day as we're working with this population and what's important for everyone to know in the case that hopefully none of you guys do or no one you know does, but in case you get a concussion, what can you do to make sure it's the quick and easiest recovery possible? So, I don't know. Cool. All right. So we'll start, like I said, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I just want to go through a few myths about concussion. I already told you these are all untrue, and we're going to come back to them by the end of the presentation, and hopefully it'll have a little bit more clarity about what makes them all untrue. Some of them may be pretty obvious, some of them may be common sense, some of them may be a bit of a surprise. So helmets are an effective way to prevent concussions. Not true. My kid can deal with concussions after the game. Also not true. We work a lot with an athletic population, so a lot of our slides are going to deal with that. Loss of consciousness means that it's definitely a bad concussion. Not necessarily. All concussions are the same. That's another one that I think is widely promoted out there. You know, you just hear mild, moderate, severe. But also that's not true. There's several different types of different concussions. The best treatment is sitting in a dark room and there's no active treatment. Not the case. That can actually do more harm than good. Only football players need to worry about concussions. Hopefully that one's pretty obvious to everybody. Boys are most at risk for concussions. The opposite. And the harder the hit, the worse the symptoms. So again, these are just some basic myths that are kind of widespread out there about this injury. And as we go through our slides tonight, hopefully it'll make more sense why these are not actually true.
Hello. So full disclosure, I'm on ER call tonight. So if I look at my phone, I'm not being rude. It's probably somebody getting in touch with me for something I have to potentially leave for. So should be okay, but I'm not being rude if I'm sitting up here looking at my phone. It's something work related for me. So getting back to the topic, what is a concussion? So a concussion it's a really complex thing at times. It's a really complex scenario that happens after somebody sustains a head injury. So what it does is, obviously it affects the brain. We all know that at this point. And what's going on is that there's a lot of biomechanical forces that are happening that will cause indirect forces to occur to the head and mainly inside the brain. So it's not necessarily a structural abnormality. To actually be diagnosed with a concussion, your imaging has to be negative. If your imaging has any sort of structural abnormality to it, at that point it's considered a different type of brain injury that is would be more specific to where the actual bleed is. So imaging is going to be negative, but you're still going to have all the metabolic and dysfunction that occurs with a head injury that's going on more at the neurological and axonal level, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And you will still get all the same constellation of symptoms, the physical, the cognitive, the emotional symptoms that people with more severe brain injuries can get at times after they recover. So.
All right, so this looks, I guess, like a complicated slide, but really it kind of sums up really nicely the way that we conceptualize and understand what a concussion is. So if you imagine your brain as kind of an egg yolk, right? And you get a concussion, the egg yolk shakes around. So the brain basically just shakes around inside your skull. And concussion comes from the Latin term concussus, which means to shake violently, because that's what the brain does. And when it does that, it essentially sets off a number of chemical changes. So like Brandon said, typically there's no bleeding, no swelling, no structural damage. The brain looks normal, but at this teeny tiny microscopic level, there's a lot of chemical changes. And the end result of that is that your brain doesn't get as much energy as it needs. So at its most simple form, a concussion is just an energy problem. And so what happens is we have this gap, and the brain basically tries to compensate by closing that energy crisis by, for lack of a better term, by stealing energy from different places. And so our job as clinicians is to try to figure out for each patient that we see, what are those places? Where is that energy breakdown happening? Because once we have an understanding of that, we'll have a better understanding of A, what is this person feeling? And B, what do we need to do to get them feeling better? So that, we tell that to every patient that we see, and that, in my mind at least, kind of demystifies some of this injury. It kind of makes it a little bit more clear about what exactly is happening. Why am I feeling this way?
So the next slide that we're going to talk about is how do we find out if you have a concussion? So talking about, like Paul said earlier, we work with the athletic population here in Raleigh, so the high school athletes and everything. So a lot of this talk is going to be, or a lot of this slide is going to be more geared towards what we're seeing on the field. And this is where they get to what we'd call the pre-hospital. So car wrecks and stuff like that, all that is pre-hospital. And so this is all pre-hospital stuff. So first and foremost, one of the most important things to remember now is if an athlete or somebody shows any of these signs while on the field, they are pulled from competition for the rest of the day. Okay, at the high school and college level, it is at the rest of the day. And I even think now at the pro level, it's the rest of the competition. And that is a lot different than it was even 10 years ago. When I was an athletic trainer, we would have different grades and different scales that we would use, and depending on where the athlete fell would determine if they could go back that day, or they could go back that half, or they were out for a prolonged period of time. So that's totally, you get injured, you're out for the day, which is a huge leap forward in management of these injuries. So immediate signs, loss of consciousness. Yes or no. You know, not everybody that has loss of consciousness has a concussion afterwards. And not everybody that doesn't lose consciousness doesn't have a concussion. So you could hit your head, not lose consciousness, but still have signs of a concussion. What we call retrograde amnesia. So they can't remember anything that happened, right? Either you can't remember anything that happened, what they had for lunch that day, or what they had for breakfast that morning. And then antegrade amnesia is they perseverate on things. And so you'll tell them, you'll ask them a question. You'll say, what year is it? And they'll say, I don't know. You tell them it's 2019. And then right away they ask you, wait, what year is it? Or they'll keep asking, what happened? So they will not be able to remember simple conversations that just happened 30 seconds prior. They might be disoriented, they might be confused. One little anecdote, when I was an athletic trainer, we had a soccer player who went up for a header with another soccer player. They collided heads. And, the player initially looked fine, started running around, but they actually stopped the game because he then went over to the other team's sideline. And the reason why he did that was because he was actually recruited by that other team while he was in high school and thought that he played for them and forgot that he played for us. And so they brought him back to our sideline and said, y'all need to take care of this. You handle this, not our problem. And so, we took it from there. So, they're disoriented, they're confused. They might also, appear dazed or stunned, that glassy eye look, you could tell that they're there, but they're not there. What we will say sometimes is lights on, but they're in the backyard. Nobody's home, they're in the backyard. So they just have this far off looking glance. Balance problems, we'll touch a little bit more on this a little bit later on in the presentation, but that's dealing more with your vestibular system. And so people will be walking unable to keep a straight line. They look intoxicated. We actually had a patient who was in a car crash, continued to drive without getting treatment, got pulled over, and they thought that he got a DUI because they thought he was intoxicated on some substance, because when they did their field testing, he couldn't keep a straight line. And in actuality, went more back to his injury. And then just answering questions slowly as well. So they would just be really delayed. Conversations would not happen fluidly like we're having a conversation now, or like you would be having a normal conversation. They're just really delayed in speech and really delayed in answering. And the most important thing on the pre-injury side or the pre-hospital side is you got to make sure nothing else is going on. You got to make sure that the patient's not more injured than what they're initially showing. So we have red flags that we would, that we look for. Mainly, if somebody's complaining out of the worst headache of their life, a 10 out of 10, regardless of if you try to give them a little bit of analgesia, Tylenol or ibuprofen, it's just not cutting it, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. Another thing that we get really concerned of is if somebody comes off the field and they have what we call a lucid period, so where they're acting normal, and then 5, 10, 15 minutes later, they pass out, or they're not acting right, they're vomiting, they have nausea, or they're exhibiting these symptoms. At that point, we're a little bit more concerned that there's more of a structural type problem going on, and it's more than just a concussion. So, and then obviously slurred speech to make sure they didn't have a stroke or anything like that. And then neck pain, we always, if it's involving the head, your head's connected to your neck, there's always a likelihood that you have injured some sort of cervical vertebra at that time. And so we got to rule that out as well. We got to rule out the big stuff before we move on.
All right, so at this point, all that's been ruled out, and they get to the office, and the way that we evaluate this injury is much different than it used to be. It used to be, even just 5-10 years ago, do you have a headache? Yes or no? All right, let's wait it out. Now it's very different. So a typical evaluation has 3 parts, and we'll kind of skim the surface of each one. The first one is a detailed clinical interview. The second one is what's called a vestibular ocular screening, and then the third one's neurocognitive testing. And then we're going to take that information and develop a treatment plan for that individual. And once we get a better sense of what is the severity, what is the prognosis, we're going to let everyone know, with permission, but let their coaches know, let their trainers, let their family, let their teachers, let your boss, anyone that needs to know what's going on and what they can do to help that person. So one of the things on there is identify the severity of the injury. Now that used to be based on kind of loss of consciousness and for how long, and then post-traumatic amnesia, so difficulty remembering before and after the event. Now we have a better understanding that those things don't really correlate with recovery time. So you can lose consciousness and recover much faster than someone that doesn't. So now instead of grading the injury on mild, moderate, or severe, it's much more dichotomous. It's just, yes, you had a concussion, no, you didn't. Here's what we're going to do about it. So part 1, the clinical interview. Will you hit it actually? Thanks. So we want to get a sense of 2 main things. 1, what are the symptoms that person's having? And like I said, it's not so much yes or no questions. We want to really get a sense of the details, the variability, the intricacies. Because from our perspective, there's a big difference between an individual that gets a headache when they wake up in the morning versus an individual that gets a headache after 30 minutes of reading or using their computer. And there's a big difference between someone who can't fall asleep at night because their neck hurts or someone that can't fall asleep because their thoughts are racing and they just can't concentrate. So there's 4 main categories of symptoms. We don't have to go over each one, but they're pretty obvious: cognitive, physical, sleep, and emotional. And as we are going through these with everybody, there's, on both ends of the spectrum, we have to be aware that there's motivation to lie, right? So when we're working with athletes, what's the motivation? They want to tell us that everything is great and they have no symptoms whatsoever and they can play in their game now. On the other side of the spectrum, if you're working with car accidents, workers' comp, a lot of other things, there's a lot of different secondary gains, and they want to tell you that they're feeling terrible, they'll never be the same, they shouldn't have to work a day in their life. So we want to get a sense of what's really going on. What is this person really feeling? And we want to look at it very objectively. So this is just a research study from a few years ago. The most common symptoms just within that first week of injury. And I want to highlight it because, number 1, headache, right? Probably not a surprise, but what is surprising is not everyone gets a headache after a concussion. But if you look right below that, you go right into the cognitive problems, the thinking skills. And that's really scary because those obviously physical symptoms interfere with how you're functioning day to day. But if you're having difficulty concentrating, feeling foggy, memory problems, your work and your school is going to be super impacted. And that becomes very scary to deal with on a functional level. So that's part 1. The other part of the interview is we want to get a sense of who is this person? Who is this individual sitting in front of us? Because one of the things that's most important in predicting recovery is, what did this person bring to the table? One of the things we like to say is concussion fights dirty. So if you have some sort of a weakness or a vulnerability pre-injury, and then you get a concussion, what's going to happen to it? It's going to get worse, right? And this is a easy correlation. You know, if you have a person that gets headaches, you get a concussion, your headaches are probably going to get worse. If you get motion sick or car sick, that suggests a weak vestibular system, which Brandon will talk about in a second. Probably you're going to feel dizzy and nauseous and foggy after the injury. So we really want to get a sense of who is this person, what did they bring to the table, and how is that going to help us inform what their recovery is probably going to look like.
So going back towards the vestibular system now, the vestibular system, as we showed on the other slides, it's one of the most commonly injured systems with a head injury, and it's because of where it lives. So your vestibular system lives in your inner ear. So in your inner ear, you have three what we call semicircular canals, and it's because that's what they are. They're literally semicircles. And inside those semicircular canals, there's what we like to call crystals or rocks, if you will. And it tells us, and what they do is when you move your head certain directions, the rocks will move, and it will sit there and tell you if you're looking up, looking down, looking left, looking right, or if you're doing this with your head as well, okay? What we like to call Pavlov's dog, or what I call the Pavlov's dog move, you know, like the huh? And so it will also sit there and tell you where you are in space. And so it tells you that your hand's up here, yet your foot's down there. It tells you if you're balancing, or it helps you balance on 1 foot, helps you balance on 2 feet, okay? So you can imagine if we sit there and we take those little crystals or we take those rocks and we shake them up during a head injury, and if they're not functioning correctly, you're going to be dizzy, and that's going to be miserable, okay? If you wake up every day and you're dizzy, and everything that you try to do, every time you try to move your head in any directions, even if it's just to look down to tie your shoe, or to look to your left to talk to somebody, all of a sudden you're dizzy and you get nauseous and you vomit. It's a horrible feeling. So that's one of the reasons why we really focus on the vestibular system. And 50% of the athletes that have a concussion will actually sit there and report vestibular system symptoms afterwards. And 61% of patients that have that are post-concussive, they will sit there and tell us that when we have them move their eyes during one of our tests, that they will report at least one symptom during our little tests. And we look for 4 or 5 different symptoms, and they say, you know, I at least have one, and that's 61%. So it's one of the main reasons, big reasons why we do focus so much on this system in the management of concussions.
So that's part 2. And then part 3 is neurocognitive testing. So what we want to do is look at that person's thinking skills. And we do a little evaluation looking at thinking skills that are typically impacted by concussion. So memory, attention, processing speed, language skills, all of that. And what that's going to do is that's going to be really helpful in helping develop a return to work and or a return to school plan. And it helps kind of quantify the injury a little bit as well, because you get someone, an educated person, typically, you know, very high achieving, and then they see some of the data, and sometimes it becomes very eye-opening of, oh, this is something I need to take very seriously. So we have those 3 components: the interview, the vestibular screening, and the neurocognitive testing. We take all that data, it's kind of like a puzzle, and we put it together, and we figure out that energy breakdown I was talking about before. Where is that happening? And what we know, the most recent research tells us there's 1 of 6 places that breakdown can be occurring. And each of these has its very own targeted treatment plans and its very own way of dealing with things. And some people come in and they have just 1 of those. I call this the chessboard, all right? And every patient we see, we want to figure out where are they on this chessboard. Some people are just 1, it's very easy, and they, you know, we can deal with that. Some people are 2, some people have all 6, and then it just becomes much more complicated. When we made the slide, it was a little hard, but they actually should all be interconnected because there's a lot of close relationships with each of them. And if you think about it, there's, I don't know, I'm not a knee doctor, but 30 different kinds of knee injuries. Why would we expect there to just be one type of concussion? And why would we expect there to just be a one-size-fits-all approach? There's not. Our goal is to figure out, again, where is that breakdown happening so that we can get the most targeted treatment and get that person better as quickly and as safely as possible.
That leads more into where we're going during this clinical interview, and to help this individual that has this concussion that we're trying to help get better. What part of the puzzles do we need to find? What pieces do we need to find to help them get better? And so we take all the information that we have and we gather it to help come up with individualized treatment plans. So other things that we look for during the interview are any sort of risk factors. Like Paul said, concussions fight dirty. So we got to find out where their risk factors are, and that can be previous concussions. If you've had one concussion, you're more susceptible at having subsequent concussions after that. One of the main questions that we ask is if somebody says that they've had a concussion, our follow-up question is, did you fully recover? If they say, yes, I fully recovered, then we know that our goal should be to get them back to being fully recovered. If they said, no, I didn't fully recover, I've since had this deficit and this deficit, then we know we shouldn't expect to get them back to 100%. Their 100% might be a little bit lower. Their 100% might be 90% for me or 90% for you. We also ask about migraines. People with migraines, even if you've had a migraine back when you were, in your teenage years, where a lot of people have them, and you haven't had one for 15, 20 years, you can now develop migraines again after having a concussion. And so that's another risk factor that we look at. We look at any sort of learning disabilities or any sort of ADHD, ADD, or ADD type symptoms. We look at the patient's sex. Females are more at risk for concussions than males. Even though males tend to be in a more violent environment with the way that we like just to be naturally, females, the way that their pathophysiology and everything, what's going on at a cellular level, makes them a little bit more disposed for concussions than males. Age as well, okay? We all know the younger population, a little bit more predisposed just because due to their nature of being a little bit more aggressive with things, not being as careful as when you get a little bit older, okay? But thankfully, they tend to bounce back a little bit more, okay? So they tend to bounce back a little bit faster. And then, what's that last one? I can't read from here. Ocular history. So we also ask about any sort of eye problems that they might have had beyond just like wearing glasses. Because once again, if, we're talking about the vestibular system and how your eyes play into that system as well. If we know that you already have some sort of eye problem going into it, that we're going to have to work with you on that. So we look at the risk factors, obviously, that we know that they've had a concussion, or else we wouldn't be seeing them, and then we figure out where they fall on the chessboard, or what piece of the puzzle we have to find and what piece of the puzzle we have to put back in together. And that's where we start referring people to different therapies. If we think that the vestibular system's involved, we work very closely with vestibular specialists. So they're physical therapists who have additional training in the vestibular system. If we think that it's an eye problem that's causing their pupils aren't constricting, they're not what we call accommodating correctly, they're not focusing, we will refer to a neurooptometrist, and they will do what's called vision therapy, where they use cool glasses and cool little games to retrain the eyes. And then anxiety is actually a huge component with the concussion as well. And people can really get fixated on that they're not getting better as fast as they thought, and it can cause them to think, I'm not going to get any better. This is going to be my new normal, which is a term that we hate when patients use in our clinic. Well, this is just my new normal. It's like, no, this isn't going to be your new normal. Let's work through things. And so, we will refer people as well to just a normal psychologist. People on car crashes, they have PTSD just as much as somebody, who has been overseas, or, somebody in the armed services. They also have PTSD, and so we will refer people to psychologists to sit there and kind of talk through things. And I had one patient, she went on vacation, she goes, I felt great while I was on vacation. Then I came back and all my symptoms returned. And I looked at her and said, it's anxiety. And she looked at me, and we've been we've been, approaching her with this for multiple visits now. And she looked at me, she goes, yeah, I guess, you're right, because when I was on vacation, I felt great, Well, who doesn't feel good on vacation? So, so it's things like that, really help patients get better and get them back to their normal lives. Okay. So more post-injury management stuff. When I said we always ask, have you had a concussion before, and did he return back to normal? Because what we want to prevent against is returning people to play way too early, or even just too early. Because if you don't fully recover, these symptoms everything starts to add up, and suddenly it's a cumulative effect. And so concussion number 2 might happen a little bit easier than concussion number 1, or number 3 happens a little bit easier than number 2, or it might be a little bit worse because we didn't fully heal from the previous concussion. So obviously we treat all the symptoms, and we have what's called a return to play protocol. And you guys can read it on the screen, but it's a stepwise process on how to get people back to play. And it's something as simple as, I am able to, in the college or in the high school or college world, I'm able to go to school and do my schoolwork and not get symptoms. Perfect, we're doing good. Let's start walking, our light activity. And then we ramp them up from there. And during every single stage of this, we ask them, how are your symptoms? The minute that they start triggering symptoms, we know, okay, this is the level we're stopping at right now. And then continue to treat for a few more days, bring them back through the protocol, see if we can get to another level, with the goal being that they're able to get back to their functional status. So for an athlete, able to go back out in the field and do what they are supposed to be able to do and not have any symptoms. Another little anecdote that I like to tell is, the soccer player that I told you about that hit his head and couldn't remember what team he was playing for, we brought him through the protocol. It took us about 3 weeks or so to get him back. And the day that he was supposed to come back, he comes down to my office. He's like, I feel great. I said, cool, let's go put you on the bike. And we had this whole protocol on the bike that we did to really stress him. Get him on the bike. We do our exercises on the bike. Get him really worked up. He's like, I feel awesome. I'm ready to go play. Said, perfect, let's go change. We'll get you, I'll call the coach, let him know. Their locker room was right next to my office. And so he goes to the locker room, goes to change, and I notice 5-10 minutes goes by and he's not out. And I'm like, where is he? So I go back to the locker room. He's laying on the bench with a towel over his head crying. I said, what's the matter? He goes, my headache's back. And so I was like, you're not cleared yet, And because we put him through a really strenuous exercise and it brought some of his symptoms back, it's like, I got to shut you down again. And, we didn't start from square one. We just went back to the previous level, treated for a few days, and then by the time later on that week, he was good to go. And we got him back. So that's kind of how we will progress through a return to play to get people, at least athletes, back.
So as we talk about how to treat the injury, like I said, the start of this was talking about different misconceptions, different myths, different, the way people view the injury. And so there was a poll. It was now it was a few years back, but what they did was they surveyed 2,000 just U.S. adults and just asked them all these questions about concussion and concussion treatment, what they knew, what they didn't know. And some of the results, in my mind, were pretty staggering. So a couple of the highlights, basically 1/4 of adults think that one single concussion will change their life forever. That's scary. 72% think that the damage is permanent, and 4 out of 5 think that you can only lessen the symptoms but never actually recover. If you think about what that does to your psyche, what does that do mentally if you feel like this is just the end? This is just a death sentence, essentially. 4 out of 5 are not comfortable that they would know the steps, how to treat it or manage it. That's fine. What do they think? What do U.S. adults think are recommended? 50% say no exercise, no activity whatsoever. We'll talk about that. About a third say get hydrated. That's actually very good, but only a third. And 28% say over-the-counter medicine, which has pros and cons to it as well. And then another one that was just kind of sad to us. We both went into this because we're sports fans. We realize we grew up playing sports. We value sports. You can learn so much from sports. 1/4 of adults don't let their children play certain sports because of the fear of concussion, which understandable, but also very sad in its own right. So what do we do to combat some of these misconceptions? So when I came from, I was up in Pittsburgh, and we put together this meeting. And it was basically this invitation-only meeting of the top concussion researchers and clinicians in the country. And everyone got together, got in a room, and there was these statements of agreement, and everyone voted on them. And I was a fellow, so I just took the pictures while everyone was doing it. But there was some really great discussion going on, and there were some really interesting findings, and it ended up being published in I think, the Neurosurgery Journal. And it's really interesting. We'll go through a couple of them to be able to contrast what the experts who are doing this every day are saying as compared to just the general population. So
the first statement of agreement is prescribed physical and cognitive rest may not be an effective strategy for all patients following concussions. When the public was polled, 50% of the public agreed with this statement. So that means 50% of the public thinks that, at that time, thought sitting in a dark room, not doing anything, was the appropriate management for concussions. And my favorite is wake them up every 30 minutes to find out, make sure that they're going to wake up, right? If you woke me up every 30 minutes, you would not like who I was. It is not, and you would not want to be woken up either. It does not put you in a very good mood, okay? So where 75% of the experts agreed that physical and cognitive rest is probably not the best effective strategy following concussions. So thankfully, after that meeting, they were able to make some strides in getting all the people managing and treating concussions on the same page and go in the same direction.
So another one was strict brain rest is not recommended after a concussion. And 75% of the experts agree. They said this is not how we should deal with this. And 22% I think somewhat agree, and then there was maybe one person that didn't agree, but I don't know why. But if you think about it, strict brain rest, who lives life that way? What they're basically saying is don't do anything. So don't go to work, don't go to school, don't exercise, don't do anything social, don't use your phone, don't be on the computer, don't watch TV, don't do anything that you enjoy, don't do anything that makes you you. What is going to happen when you have no healthy outlets? Concussion symptoms are going to happen. There was a research study, and they basically just took a healthy population of people, and they told them to do that. They said, do these things, or rather, don't do these things. And it took 3 to 6 days before they developed headaches, anxiety, sleep issues, all of these same symptoms, and they had no concussion. There was nothing wrong with them. So if that's what's happening to a healthy population, we're absolutely not going to tell a concussed population to get better by doing these things. So I think the next slide talks about active recovery and how we want to approach it instead.
To active treatment strategies, 91%, is that 91? I can't read, I'm sorry. 97% of the the experts say we need active treatment. Gone are the days of sitting in a dark room. What I tell patients, if it makes you happy, do it. Simple as that. If your symptoms get worse, back off what you're doing, go find something else to do that makes you happy. And then when your symptoms are more manageable, go back to doing that activity that you're initially doing. It's the expose recover model. So that's my simple speech is if it makes you happy and doesn't put your head at risk, do it.
So what he was talking about, that expose recover, that's how we want to approach things. We don't want to avoid activities. We don't want to do nothing. We also don't want to throw anyone in the deep end and just feel absolutely terrible. So it's kind of it's a gradual approach where we basically tell people, do things. The only real rule is don't do anything where you can get hit in the head, right? But otherwise, do all of your normal day-to-day activities. If your symptoms get a little worse, that's fine. That's actually normal and that's expected. Take a break, let them die down a little bit, and then go back to that activity. And if you do it consistently, the amount of time it takes you, the amount of time you can tolerate before you feel symptoms should get longer and longer, and your break should get shorter and shorter. And over time, stay diligent with it, you'll start to see some real progress.
Things that we will try to implement early is what we call behavioral modifications or behavioral management. Easiest way to put it is it's healthy living. Get plenty of sleep, but we don't want you oversleeping. So maintain your normal routine. Going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time. If you weren't a napper, don't start napping during the day, okay? Eat 3 well-balanced healthy meals. Don't skip breakfast, right? Whatever, like just what your mom told you. Drink plenty of water. All right? We always tell our patients carry a water bottle with you, okay? Exercise, like we said, light activity, we love it. I love light activity. Get out there and do things, even if it's simple as walking your dog around the block. It's something, okay? And manage the stress, okay? Try your best to remove yourself from stressful situations whenever possible. It's not always easy. We understand life happens. Okay, but the more we can do to help lessen your stressors, the better off you're going to be in the healing process of getting you back.
All right, so one of the other statements of agreement, which I think is probably the most important one, concussion is treatable. This is a totally manageable injury. And it's just a matter of getting to the right place, understanding how to approach it, and getting the right treatment, because this is not a death sentence. This is not some boogeyman. This is an injury just like any other injury to any other part of your body that we can absolutely treat as long as we approach it the right way. So if you'll go back to those misconceptions. Let's run through them real quick. Hopefully, if we did our job, we've covered them all. Helmets are an effective way to prevent concussions. Not true. The way the mechanism works, that brain shaking in your skull, no helmet can change that. No helmet can change that. And helmets are great. They obviously, they help prevent skull fractures and other more serious injuries. We're certainly advocating that you wear them when it's appropriate, but it's not really going to help prevent a concussion. Nothing can truly prevent a concussion. My kid can deal with concussions after the game. Not so. Like he said, when in doubt, sit it out. You want it, and this happens, in any activity. It doesn't even have to be athletes. But there was a study a few years ago, and they basically took a population of people and they stayed in the game after they were injured. They did not tell them to do this. They would have gotten a lot of trouble for that. But this is kids that just didn't report their injuries. 15 minutes of playing doubled their recovery time. So that's not that much when you're in the heat of a game. 15 minutes, and it added weeks and weeks onto the back end of their injury. Loss of consciousness means it's definitely a bad concussion. No, we talked about that. It's not really an indicator of severity or recovery time. All concussions are the same. No, there's several types. We have that chessboard that was up here. Our goal is to identify what type of concussion, essentially, where is that energy breakdown happening. The best treatment is sitting in a dark room. No, we discussed that ad nauseum. Only football players need to worry about concussions. This can happen to anybody, athlete, non-athlete. Concussions don't really discriminate at all. Boys are more at risk. Brandon touched on this. There's several hypotheses why girls are more at risk, but if you look at sports where like soccer or whatnot, where boys and girls both play, girls have a higher incidence of concussion. Couple theories. One is weaker neck muscles, so if they take a hit, their necks aren't as strong to kind of withstand that force. Another is just hormones, more vulnerable to headaches, what have you. And then the harder the hit, the worse the symptoms. Not necessarily, you don't even have to get hit in the head to get a concussion. You can take a hit in the body, and if you get a whiplash, the brain might move, and it's still going to occur. So hopefully those are all clear now, and I'm more, clear about why they're not true.
So just to summarize briefly, thank you all for paying attention to us for as long as you did. Concussions is not a simple injury. It's complex. The brain is not a simple thing. I tell patients it's the computer. We shook up the computer. Now we got to get it to reboot. We got to help find a way to get it to reboot for you, for the patient. So detailed clinical interviews and eye exams and neurocognitive testing, obviously key factors to helping us get people back to their daily lives, hopefully fast, but the body's only going to heal at whatever rate it wants to heal at. And obviously it's going to be helpful, it's really helpful if we're able to identify what's going on, and so we can get the patient on the right path to recovery. And the most important thing, and after I do my clinical exam, what I lead with every patient is, this is treatable. This is not going to control your life. The concussion does not have control over you. You are going to have control over the concussion, and this is how we're going to allow that to happen to help everybody get better. And then our shameless plug.
Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you very much. All right. Now let's have the hands are already going up. Yes, this is what I like. But just so you know, I'll have a microphone, and Anu will have a microphone. So we'll move the mics around the room and get to as many questions as we have time remaining. And I'm going to start. I saw you first. You're right here in front of me.
So thanks. That was a great talk. Really interesting, and certainly optimistic. More optimistic than I believed was true for this kind of an injury. But what about all of the stories that we've all heard lots and lots of times now about professional sports people, especially football players, who end up later in their lives with suicidal tendencies and who are dysfunctional and who have lots and lots of super serious problems as a result of who knows what, maybe multiple concussions or not having been treated properly or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. And I think the end of your question starts to answer it, right? That was a previous generation, and we didn't really have those treatments. We didn't really understand the injury as much. So those guys weren't treated. There was a player that I talked to. He was a former NFL player, and he took a hit during a game, and he knew, I can't show I can't let anyone else know that something's wrong because they might pull me from the game. So similar to Brandon's guy, actually, he went to the wrong huddle, and so they noticed and they took him out. And the athletic trainer looked at him and he was like, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "How many fingers am I holding up?" And he got it right. And he said, son, are you a man or a woman? And he said, I think I'm a man. And he's in the NFL. And he goes, great, you're right. You can go back in. And that was it. And that was all the evaluation that he got. And so to look at him and to understand that this injury was not really respected or taken seriously, it's understandable why some of these guys are having issues. The real question is going to be looking at this generation, the kids that we're able to work with, even the current NFL players where there's so many different protocols in place, and we're going to see what they look like years from now. The other thing is it's really hard to do research with those guys because there's no control group for an NFL player. There's no one else that really lives a lifestyle the way they do. And there's so many other confounding variables, whether it be steroids, drug use, alcohol use, just the way they live their life, then it's really hard to do research and have a direct one-to-one comparison to the point where we can say football, concussions, that injury is exactly why this is occurring. So that was a very roundabout way to kind of say it's understandable why those guys are having issues because unfortunately the knowledge base and the attention wasn't given to the injury. But I'm hopeful and optimistic that as we move forward, we're not going to see those kinds of stories anymore.
A couple slides earlier, there was a graph that had some percentages on it, and I was just wondering, especially the one before that one, who are the people who only somewhat agree that concussions are, is that a scientific group of professionals saying that they only somewhat agree that concussion is treatable?
Sadly, yeah, that came from that meeting in Pittsburgh that I was talking about, where it was just the invite-only guest of concussion experts. These are people that have devoted their life and their career to working with this injury, and yeah, for whatever reason, there was probably one or two in the room that somewhat agreed. I don't know any more than that. I also think it's kind of disheartening, but I mean, I will say that they're in this, they're the experts, that population, but even more sad than that is the general population, that number would be a whole lot higher. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Way back at the beginning of your talk, you had a slide that showed calcium and potassium ions and talked about the energy crisis that is basically what a concussion is. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what this energy crisis is, and especially what the slide here is depicting about calcium and potassium ions.
Yeah, so basically we've got in our brains, we've got the neurons. And everything we do happens because our neurons are firing off and communicating with each other. So what happens when you get a concussion and that shaking mechanism occurs, the wall that separates the inside of the neuron from the outside of the neuron starts to kind of shear a little bit. It becomes very thin. And what happens, calcium rushes into the cell, and what that does is that constricts our blood vessels. So that's where the energy is. But at the very same time, potassium rushes out, and that sends out signals to our brain that we need more energy than normal. So it's a perfect storm where at the very time that we need more energy than normal, we're actually getting even less. And that's what creates that energy crisis. Now, what we didn't say is that in animal models, that will go away. That resolves on its own over time. But depending on what's impacted, what some of the residuals are, sometimes you're just left with symptoms that still need to be managed.
Yes, earlier you mentioned and discussed some of the symptoms in concussion had to do with dizziness, disorientation, balance. To me, it sounds an awful lot like some of the symptoms of vertigo. Can you speak to that?
So that's where we will refer a lot to our vestibular specialists, because it is a lot of the symptoms of vertigo. And that's where, when we do our clinical examination, we tease that out more. We ask more specific questions. And, some people might sit there and say, I sit there and I feel like the world is spinning, which is vertigo. And that might be because one of these little crystals, one of these little rocks, is just enough out of place. We send them to the vestibular specialist. They do what's called a Dix-Hallpike maneuver with patients, where they move their heads in funky ways and they look at their eyes. And if their eyes go certain ways with certain maneuvers, they'll know that it's a positive Dix-Hallpike. And then they're able to, it sounds very violent, and for lack of better terms, they're able to kind of snap that stone back in place, and also the patient's vertigo is much improved. So it is a lot of the same symptoms of vertigo, and that's things that we tease out during the interview.
I'm sure this has been done by people in the helmet business, but what Gforce would be associated with the onset of a concussion?
So there's no specific Gforce. I could literally, and this has happened before, so I work in the trauma ICU over at WakeMed. We see a lot of people who fall, a lot of older population falling on blood thinning medications, okay? They fall, they bonk their head just a little bit, right? And it just could be, I stood up too fast and I didn't even lose consciousness. And they could have a concussion. So there's no specific Gforce. I could literally fall off this stage and bonk my head a little bit and have a concussion. It just depends. There's no, and that's what we're talking about with the myths, is the worse the hit doesn't necessarily mean that the patient's going to get a concussion or that the concussion's going to be worse than somebody who just gets in a simple fender bender, okay, and walks away just fine, and then 2 days later starts having these symptoms.
Okay.
I know schools are doing research, though.
Yeah, there's a lot of ongoing research on it, but no one's identified any number at this point. If someone did, it would be very helpful. There's a lot of work with with sensors in the helmets, but sorry. Right, exactly.
They have helmets that have a indicator that measures the maximum hit.
Right, and then, Virginia Tech does a lot of work in that. And then, there's people looking at that data that will say, all right, let's pull that guy and let's just check him out and make sure. But there's still a lot that get missed. And then there's also a lot of times where you might have these extremely high impacts, these extremely violent collisions, totally fine, no issues. So it works both ways, for better, for worse, I guess.
So it's such a relief to hear that you're not supposed to sit in a dark room doing nothing. And this idea of doing normal activities or whatever makes you happy until your head starts to hurt, and taking a break sounds great. But I'm wondering, what role does medication play in that? So if you're taking ibuprofen, are you masking pain that you need to be feeling so you know when to stop?
That's a great question. So we won't jump right to the medications right away. Our goal is to sit there and use more of these behavior modifications so that patients can kind of help gauge and guide themselves. It does get to a point, though, where we had a patient today being like, listen, I tried this. I cannot do anything combined because my head hurts no matter what. At that point, we do have to give some sort of symptom relief to allow the patient to be more, to get on with the therapy program. And so we do encourage, me, since I'm more medicine-y than Paul is with my background, I probably push the ibuprofen a little bit more, with a caveat of, you got to be careful for rebound headaches, because they are a real thing and they can happen. So we try not to push it too much, but if they need it, they need it.
Yes, I've heard and I've read where they say that some guys have played professional football because of the head injuries. They're not in the, let's say, early to mid 30s or 40s. or mid-40s that they found out that they're starting to show some different scans on them, like brain scans, and found out they're starting to show some of the signs of early signs of Alzheimer's. What do y'all know about that? I mean, because it's like they're trying to say the concussions or head injuries linked to a high risk of developing Alzheimer's. What do you know about that?
So with Alzheimer's, we really, from my understanding, we really don't know what causes Alzheimer's yet. We can't sit there and say it's definitely this, or this is a risk factor, or this is a risk factor. And it's kind of the same thing with the early Alzheimer's, and what I'm sure the question is going to come, CTE, you know, the dreaded CTE. We don't know what causes that yet. You know, for some people think it's more of a protein buildup or that occurs in the brain that leads to Alzheimer's and leads to dementia. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily that we don't know if it's necessarily repetitive hits, you know, lead to early onset Alzheimer's or early onset dementia or anything like that. I don't know if you have.
Similar to the answer for the first question, if someone were to take repetitive hits and, you know, like the older generation and not get treated, not really respect the injury and keep at it, all bets are off, right? But there's not really certainly any correlation between one uncomplicated injury that was well managed and then significant issues down the road.
I was wondering, in the recovery process, when you guys were talking about, why do you start with aerobic, like light aerobic activity, and it specifically said no weight training?
Usually because weight training, so light aerobic activity, walking, you know, something that's not going to get your heart rate extreme. It's going to raise it a little bit, but it's not going to send it through the roof. And when you weight lift, so if you lift weights properly, you're supposed to be exhaling during what we call the concentric, or when you're actually lifting the weight. Majority of people don't. And what they're doing is, if you lift like I lift, I grunt, you know, and bear down as I'm going up. And so what that's going to do is that actually increases your heart rate, it increases your blood pressure, shoots everything to go up, which is in turn can cause your symptoms to worsen when we don't want them to worsen necessarily. So we always start out light, simple daily activities, because if they can't even do the simple stuff yet, walking to their car, walking to work, walking to school, walking to class, then they're definitely not ready to push their bodies and do more strenuous exercise and get their heart rate going even faster than what you normally would.
Yeah. Can you speak to hydration again? Is it with the calcium, potassium in the brain, or is it just supporting the other systems, which then helps?
All the above. Just trying not to get dehydrated. You get dehydrated, you get a headache, right, on a normal day. So.
When I had a fall when I was playing pickleball, I used ice. Was that good or bad? Okay.
I mean, it's going to relieve the symptoms of the headache itself. Is it going to speed up your recovery for a concussion? No. Is it going to hurt your recovery for a concussion? No. You know, but it probably helped with the bruise and with the knot on your head and just symptomatically made you feel better.
Okay. Was bleeding a bad or a good thing?
Bleeding on the outside?
Mm-hmm.
It's indifferent. Once again, it just means that you cut your head. And so it doesn't mean that you necessarily suffered a more severe head injury or less severe head injury. Some of our worst head injuries that we see in the trauma and the neuro intensive care unit, they have not a single mark on them. You know, but yet, you know, you take a picture of inside their brain and it's awful what's going on.
How current is your information? How current is your information? Is it within the last 5 years? Yeah. Well, I had a brain bleed 5 years ago. I ended up at WakeMed in the trauma unit and stayed in intensive care a week. Yeah. And I had all the symptoms, everything, but I did not go to the hospital with my head. I went with my elbow. And I had had a fall, and they did all the x-rays, and they sent me by ambulance, which I was scared. They said, who is the president? And I said, well, it's Obama. You know. So anyway, I just wondered if this has all changed, because they did keep me in the trauma unit and then in intensive care, no lights, and kind of the old. They kept waking me to see if I was alive.
So, yeah. So that was me. I apologize.
I thought you looked familiar.
Yeah, lots of people say that, right? You can blame me later. But no, it's a great question, because, 5 years ago, we were kind of over here, and a majority of the clinicians were over in the don't do anything and sit in a dark room. Since then, so our program is 2. We just turned 2. Okay, so that's how new our program is, and so we've changed the way WakeMed and the trauma team treats these injuries, and even in our most severe head injuries now, we get you up. Even if you're on the ventilator, we get you up and sit you up, because we know early mobilization and stuff like that is good for the recovery.
Let's give our guests one more round of applause. Thanks, y'all, very much. Thanks for coming out and sharing. You didn't answer my question about the woodpeckers. I need to learn about the woodpeckers.
Yeah, so a woodpecker has basically the way their brain is their tongue goes all the way back and wraps around it. Essentially, kind of like a helmet would do, but they actually wrap around the brain and not the woodpecker's head. So they have that, it basically restricts their brain's movement. So as they're doing that, the brain can't really shake and you don't get these chemical changes. There's been a lot, they've taken that model and they've tried to do a football helmet. I mean, they've tried to do a lot with it in terms of how to protect a human's brain. You obviously can't do that because it would have to go between your skull and your brain.
It's like KT tape wrapped around the face.
Right. So, but the model has actually gotten a lot of attention in the research world in terms of, it's a fair question. Woodpeckers do this all day. They seem fine. What can we do to make ourselves more like them? So, but we don't know yet.
Well, those woodpeckers, I think, know something that we don't. Well, hey, y'all, thanks for coming out to the Science Cafe tonight. Hope that you enjoyed tonight's program. Hey, if you bump your head, go to WakeMed and talk to these two. I think you'll be in good hands. Next Thursday night, we'll be here at 7 o'clock. It's science trivia. Bring your team, compete for prizes, bragging rights. We're going to have a great time. Your quiz master is going to be the science comedian, Brian Mallow, next Thursday night. So you don't want to miss trivia. It's guaranteed to be a lot of fun. Science trivia with Brian Mallow next Thursday night. Good night, everybody.